Yeah. Members, we have an apology from Stephen Moutry. Are we aware of any other apologies or late arrivals? Okay. Page 6 of your packs, there's a request for a meeting from Public Achievement with regard to its Be the Change project, which provides development opportunities for young people across Belfast as part of T-Buck's United Youth pilot scheme. Now, the Department is scheduled to brief the Committee on the implementation of the T-Buck inquiry recommendation on the 17th of next month. Members, you will also probably be aware that the organisation, certainly according to the BBC, has announced that it's closing due to funding issues. They feel that they don't fit into the funding streams because they refuse to label young people as problems. And the stop-start nature of funding for our sector, they say, and the frequent gaps between funding programmes have been major contributors to the situation that's led to the regretful and very difficult decision to close. So that has come to light since they asked for the meeting about the specific. So what I would be proposing, members, is an informal meeting with the Chief Executive of Public Achievement, which I would like to host, and to which any other member of the committee who wishes to attend would be welcome. Would that meet with your approval as a way forward? Page 8 of your packs is an invite to a roundtable discussion on the issues Northern Ireland must consider with regard to the upcoming EU referendum. Can I ask members to contact the organisers directly if they wish to attend? There is an invitation to celebrate the Chinese Year of the Monkey. This is at Belfast Castle, and that has come through to me as chair. It's Thursday the 11th. Are members content that I, if my diary is free, attend, and if not, pass to the Vice Chair? Okay, thank you very much. Members, Washington and St Patrick's Day invitations have been offered to myself as Chair and Chris as Deputy, but I believe Chris has indicated he is not able to travel on this occasion. Are members content then that I represent the committee? Thank you. Okay. And the list of current committee invitations is at page 9 of the main pack. There's nothing there to... Okay, thank you. Okay, on to the draft minutes of our meeting held on the 20th of January, members. Those minutes being at page 11 of the main pack. And the question, as ever, are members content to agree the draft minutes of the meeting of the 20th of January? Thank you. Now, we agreed to write to the Westminster EU Scrutiny Committees, advising them of the discussions we've had with departmental officials and with the Equality Commission on the EU Equal Treatment Directive, which we discussed last week. So staff have prepared a draft letter. I'm afraid you have to switch back to tabled for that again, members, and to page 9. And can I ask our members content that that draft correspondence be issued? And that goes to the House of Commons and the House of Lords European Scrutiny Committees. Content? Thank you. The list of outstanding correspondence begins at page 17 of the pack. In the absence of comment, I direct you to the summary sheet of correspondence received since we last met. That begins at page 21 of the main pack. At page 24 is correspondence from the Committee for Justice with regard to a report on the implementation of the Youth Justice Review recommendations. The report makes reference to a number of initiatives delivered through Delivering Social Change. Members may wish to note the committee is provisionally scheduled to receive a briefing on DSC on the 17th of February. At page 26, you will find correspondence from the Assembly's EU Affairs Manager with regard to the EU Commission's continuation of the Northern Ireland Task Force, which has the aim of helping Northern Ireland participate more actively in the EU policy process and also fully benefit from EU programmes and projects. The paper from Shona advises the Director General for Regional and Urban Policy will carry out an assessment of the work of the task force before the end of 2018 and do that together with counterparts here in Northern Ireland. Are members content that we request further information on the continuation of the task force and the proposed assessment and how that's going to be done from the department? Thank you. Page 28, correspondence from the Assembly's EU Affairs Manager with regard to the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee inquiry on Northern Ireland and the EU referendum. Members, on the 18th of November, we noted the Prime Minister had set out his proposals for EU reform in a letter he sent to the European Council that had the 4 baskets, as they're being called. The committee agreed to write to the relevant departments for information on how they're engaging with their counterparts in Whitehall. Tabled from page 12, you'll find the departmental responses, which indicate there has not been a great deal of engagement on this issue. The Department for Social Development has advised that input was provided to OFMDFM for the meeting of the Joint Ministerial Committee Europe on the 7th of December. So, members, the proposal is we ask OFMDFM for details of the issues which were raised by departments in respect of EU reform in advance of that JMCE on the 7th of December, and indeed for an update on activity by the Joint Ministerial Committee on Europe. Content? Thank you. Page 120 of your pack, copy correspondence from the Committee for Employment and Learning, and this is relating to an Assembly research briefing it received on the delivery of strategic TBUC priorities and associated available funding. Members, in our inquiry report, you may recall, we recommended that all Assembly statutory committees should make it core business to include good relations as part of their regular scrutiny of departmental activity, including the monitoring of TBUC headline actions where departments have responsibility for delivery. On that basis, it might be wise to ask the statutory committees for an update of any scrutiny they've undertaken in this area. Members content? Thank you. Any other matters relating to correspondence? Chris?
There's a letter in here to the Clerk of the Education Committee regarding attainment and deprivation report. I'm just wondering, has this committee ever had any correspondence with OFMDFM regarding this report?
Which page is that, please, Chris?
23. Just, more or less, the officials are saying that it's not finished and stuff. Have you ever been given an indication when that's likely to be finished, if it's going to be this mandate? Or?
Sure, sorry. We haven't been given an indication of when it's going to be completed. We have asked to be copied into, or to be provided with a copy whenever it is available, yes.
Thanks.
So we don't really have to do anything?
No,
by rights we should be told. Okay.
Yep.
Good point, Chris. Thank you. Okay. If there's nothing else in correspondence, members, we go to the draft forward work programme, which begins at page 268 of your main pack. Now, members, there is no substantive evidence session scheduled for next week. So the question is, do we wish to meet potentially just for the sake of meeting? Or do we want to let that meeting go and reconvene in a fortnight's time on the 10th, which is the FMDFM
It is,
session?
I don't think there's any point of us meeting, Chair, but anything substantive.
Alex? Dan? Okay. Members, in that case, if you don't mind, there is a bit of business which I'm going to table, which we could have done next week, but as we're not meeting, we really need to do it. It's correspondence received just today from the department, and it's about the annual salary increase for the Assembly Ombudsman. And this is the last time, if the bill goes through, that we will have this responsibility, by the way. So the correspondence provides for an increase in the annual salary paid to Dr. Frawley, the Ombudsman and Commissioner. The correspondence advises the Senior Salaries Review Body recommended an increase from £130,875 per annum to £132,184 per annum, and that's consistent with Judicial Group 6.1, which is where the Ombudsman is grouped. That's an increase of £755 for Dr Frawley on a pro rata basis, and it would take his salary to £78,253. So, subject to NIPSO becoming law, as I say, this will be the last time we will have a role in fixing the salary of the Ombudsman. Any comments, members? So, the formal question, are we content with the proposal for the rule? This is a subordinate legislation. Yeah? All content? Happy? Done. Okay, thank you. Okay, now we have more subordinate legislation and SL1 draft transfer of functions order members. We're due to hear from departmental officials. And in your packs, you'll find a clerk's brief at page 271, the SL1 briefing paper at page 273, the draft department's transfer functions order NI 2015 at page 280, and correspondence from OFMDFM at page 305. Added to that, responses received to date from committees can be found as follows: Employment and Learning, page 309. Social Development, 311. Education, page 312. Justice, 313. Health, Social Services and Public Safety, page 314. And Agriculture is 21 of your table pack. The Department has also tabled amendments to the Department's bill. One removes the requirement to amend the Ombudsman Northern Ireland Order of 1996. Those provisions will not be required because of the NIPSO bill. A copy of the amendments is entabled again, starting at page 22, and the bill as introduced is entabled at page 23. So we welcome Tony Canavan, Director of Institutional Review Division of OFMDFM, and Geoffrey Simpson, who's Head of Institutional Review Division in OFMDFM. Head of Institutional Review and Director of Institutional Review. My word. But I take it you trump. Does Director Trump? Okay, Tony, would you make your opening remarks?
Okay. What the committee has been sent is a draft of the Transfer Functions Order, which is one of the two key elements in the statutory framework for departmental restructuring. The other is the Department's Bill, which is currently before the Assembly. The bill will dissolve 3 departments and rename 7, but the order will be needed to reallocate the functions of the 3 dissolving departments and to transfer some other functions to the future departments. The order will be made under the authority of Article 8 of the Department's Northern Ireland Order 1999. This allows the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister acting jointly to transfer and assign functions to and between departments and to make consequential provisions, including legislative amendments. The process behind this order started over a year ago when departments were invited to scope their existing statutory functions in primary legislation. This became more refined after executive decisions on restructuring in January and February 2015, which were the subject of a statement in the Assembly from the First Minister on the 2nd of March. The Office of Legislative Counsel, on our behalf, asked departments to identify statutory functions which would be impacted by the restructuring decisions, including specific provision in primary legislation. This was, in most cases, a complex operation. Legal advisers then checked returns from departments, and the Office of Legislative Counsel compiled a comprehensive draft. In December, the decisions announced in the Fresh Start document required changes to the work in train. Some of the previous work had to be abandoned. In other cases, the destination of functions had changed. All this has been taken on board in the draft which you have received. It reflects the allocation of future departmental statutory responsibilities set out in Appendix 5F of the Fresh Start document. I will sketch briefly the structure of the draft. It is organised by reference to the 6 departments from which statutory functions are transferring, and further subdivided by reference to the future departments which will receive those functions. Where a significant part of a dissolving department is transferring to one future department, there is no need to specify all transferring functions. Hence, Department for Communities, Department for the Economy and DERA are regarded as the legatee departments for DCAL, DEL and DOE respectively. This is all set out in Articles 3 to 8 and Schedules 1 to 5, and there is much more detail in the SL1 document which you've been sent. The enactments specified in these schedules are almost all primary legislation, that is, acts of this Assembly, acts of the old Northern Ireland Parliament, Westminster Acts or orders in Council. Subordinate legislation is not included except for two special cases. The first is statutory rules to implement EU law made under the authority of the European Communities Act 1972, and the other is the North-South Cooperation Implementations Bodies Order 1999. Transfers refer to the functions of the transferring departments under each provision cited. Other departments may have functions under the same provision, and these would not be affected. In some cases, amendments to legislation are needed to give proper effect to the transfer, and these are set out at Schedule 6. Articles 9 and 10 of the draft order provide for the continuity of legislation, documents, legal proceedings and other activities, and for the transfer of assets and liabilities. The next steps in this process require committee consideration of the draft. We have requested a response by the 12th of February. Any comments and suggestions from the committee will be referred to ministers and given due consideration in preparing the final version of the order. That version will need to be cleared by the Executive before being made by the First Minister and Deputy First Minister. At that stage, the made order will be sent back to the committee and to the Examiner of Statutory Rules. The First Minister and Deputy First Minister will then seek the approval of the Assembly, as this is an affirmative resolution order. And inevitably, that will be very late in the current session, which emphasises the importance of responding to the request for views from the committee within the deadline.
Okay. Tony, thank you very much indeed. You mentioned towards the beginning of your briefing there that this started, did you say about a year ago?
It started over a year ago. It actually started before the Stormont House Agreement in a bit of prudent preparation, for which OFMDFM is notorious. And the idea was on the assumption that should there be a result from the Stormont House Agreement, that there would need to be some work done fairly quickly. Now, we asked all departments to examine all their statutory functions. We didn't know at that stage what was going to transfer, what was going to be retained. But that was the bedrock for the work, which was subsequently then refined down after the Stormont House Agreement, because we knew at that point this is going to transfer. Therefore, something which is not, for instance, DETI functions, which are not going to transfer, no need to identify all of those by statutory provision.
I tell you why I ask. The Independent Review of Economic Policy, which goes back to 2008, 2009, was first to say have a single department of the economy. Was there no thought back then as to functionality if this were to come about? Because, as I understand it, everybody supported the principle.
I'm not sure that ever came before the Executive for a decision at that time. It was a recommendation, and I know that there were. I was regularly asked for information on the commitments in the programme for government for departmental restructuring, and I fed what was happening on that into the reports on the implementation of the IREP.
Okay.
But I think the next stage after that, the IREP, was the AERC consideration of restructuring in 2012, and they again took on board that issue of the single economy department.
In terms of the transfer functions that you're now proposing to put through, and the original proposals back in March, talk us through how much change there's been and where it is, please.
In terms of OFMDFM, what has changed is the idea of dividing policy from delivery in relation to community relations. That idea was abandoned. The idea of sending race relations to the Department for Communities, that was abandoned. The idea of sending policy on older people and on the sponsorship of the Commissioner for Older People to Department for Health, that was changed to sending to the Department for the Communities. The idea of sending the sponsorship of the Commissioner for Older People to the Department for Education, that was abandoned. The idea of sending some of the former military crown sites to the Department for Communities, we're talking here about Ebrington, that was abandoned, that was retained within OFMDFM. I think that's most of the changes in relation to OFMDFM. More widely, the main change was that the Department of Health retained the Fire and Rescue Service, which did not go to the Department for Justice, which was originally planned in the March announcement.
You've articulated half a dozen fairly major changes within OFM, things which were abandoned. Why were they abandoned?
Why were they planned or why were they abandoned? It became part of the negotiations in the talks which led to the Fresh Start statement.
So
I was not party to those talks,
okay,
but it was decided at political level.
Right, between Sinn Féin and the DUP.
I don't know who was involved in those negotiations and at which stages. I know at the very early stages where I was invited to come along and speak on another issue, all of the parties were there.
Okay. Now, the Executive Office is going to retain responsibility for age GFS legislation until it's...
Oh, yeah, sorry, this was the issue that arose last week, yeah.
Yeah, until...
The proceeding with that through to the stage of enactment, that is the proposal.
Yeah.
And that is not affected by this issue here because there isn't any legislation on goods, facilities and services on age discrimination yet.
But isn't it true to say that there will be other areas where policy is in development which are not being retained?
There may well be, yes, but for that specific issue, because the consultation had reached that advanced stage, I think the plan is that that will be retained and brought through by OFMDFM to the point of enactment.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if, as well as obviously, as you've made clear, there's a political negotiation which has informed how this has settled down. Has there been a methodology from your point of view in terms of how you've approached the functionality and how you deal with the realignment?
Well, I think the intention is that ultimately the goods, facilities and services policy for age will end up with the Department for Communities matching what's going to pass across in terms of employment on age discrimination in employment.
But more generally, Tony, I mean, I accept if you take the full functionality of the Northern Ireland Executive, there's a lot in it. It's complex, and there's probably a lot of judgment calls to be made rather than right answers, as it were. I'm sure there are a lot of functions which you could argue could rest here, and equally you could argue equally validly it could go here. So how do you do that? Do you have a methodology?
Do you have
a methodology?
Well, the process was that policy papers were taken to the executive after the agreement on the Stormont House Agreement, which the Stormont House Agreement referred only to the number of departments. Papers were then brought to the executive on the names of those departments and functions which might transfer between them. And that had been the outcome of certainly talks within the senior civil service and presumably involving OFMDFM as well at the latter stages, because they would have put the paper to the executive.
When the First Minister was making a statement about this back in March, 2nd of March, he said it should mean ultimately greater efficiency in our administration and improved services to our citizens. What mechanisms will be used to monitor that?
Well, there will be a programme for governments, which is, the expression that's used is going to be outcome or output oriented. And my assumption is the programme for government would be the mechanism for indicating whether the next, during the next mandate, there is more efficiency in the operation of government than in the current one.
I know it's not primarily about saving money, but one might expect some financial savings. Is there a mechanism to assess what savings are made? There
is some work which is being done by the Programme Board, which is cross-departmental. It's chaired by the Permanent Secretary of DEL, and they are attempting to identify the efficiencies and savings which will come out of all of this process.
And is there a review built in?
Sorry?
A review?
Of
how the functions are working out?
There is what's called a gateway review, which has been carried out, but that's into the operation of the programme. there are no plans, as far as I can tell, for a sort of an ex-post review of this process at some point in a year or so's time.
Would that not have been desirable?
I mean, that might be a recommendation coming out of the work of the Programme Board and the Gateway Review.
If you take it that it's very unlikely, unless you've got the wisdom of Solomon, that you'll take all these functions and in one huge go place them all in the right departments, are you open to being persuaded by the evidence, for example, in 6 months' time, OK, we haven't got that one quite right and we need to do some adjustments?
That could well happen. There had been one big mega transfer of functions order, and that was in 1999. There were a number of smaller transfer functions thereafter when individual functions, I mean, the most recent one I can think of was 2010, where there was a transfer of functions order which took responsibility for sustainable development from DOE and transferred it to OFMDFM. It's now going back to DERA. But that is the sort of readjustment of this process over the coming years which cannot be ruled out.
And of course it's happening not in isolation but with another mega policy implementation, the voluntary exit scheme.
Yeah.
How are those two working together?
Well, that's a side of this operation I'm not really qualified to speak on. I know you're asking about and have written on the subject of the number of transfers of staff and the like, but sort of my remit is confined to the legislation rather than the organisational implications for OFMDFM.
Okay, a concern has been raised, I'm sure you're aware, about employment services going to the Department of Communities, whereas the Department of the Economy also has a role to play in terms of receiving particularly European funding. Is that a valid issue to raise?
Well, we've been sent a particular letter which was sent to you, or an email which was sent from the Orchardville Society. I know the issues with the general issue around employment service and the transfer to the Department for Communities. And in terms of that, I mean, the Department for Communities will have responsibility for policy and delivery on poverty, child poverty and disability, including some functions which are transferring from OFMDFM. And it's therefore going to be well placed to support the most vulnerable in society and provide them with options to enter the workplace. And the new department is going to bring together, for the first time, welfare support and employment interventions, which are key levers for achieving social change. Integrating the work and the benefits advice is also best practice in other European countries, including the UK and Ireland, and the approach has been proven internationally to be effective. The primary contact point with employment service for most people on the ground are the jobs and benefit offices, of which there's an extensive network. And there, the Employment Service and the Social Security Agency are co-located. Bringing these together under one department will produce a more effective operation and better service for the customer, ensuring that those trapped in the benefit system are offered comprehensive support for a return to work. DEL and DSD are currently working closely together on the ground and with client groups, and this will continue in any event. Do you want me to say something specifically about Orchardville? Right. The Chief Executive of Orchardville has particular concerns about the organisation's funding package, where European Social Fund funding is channelled from the EU through DEL, and that will continue through the Department for the Economy. And match funding comes from the Disability Employment Service, which is part of the broader employment service and which will move to the Department for Communities. Many organisations in the voluntary sector receive funding packages from more than one funding provider, or one public provider, and this does not compromise their eligibility for funding. Departmental reorganisation will not impact on Orchardville's funding package. DFC and DFE will continue to work together to provide support to organisations such as Orchardville and its partners in the Supported Employment Solutions Consortium.
Well, I'm sure they will.
I say that after having gone to both DSD and the Permanent Secretary of DEL for their views on that particular bit of correspondence.
Okay. Arm's length bodies, Tony, particularly within our purview, the Commissioner for Older People and the Commissioner for Children and Younger People. Was there any consideration given to making them truly independent bodies in line with the Paris Principles?
Is this reference to the Commissioner for Younger People's idea of making them arm's-length bodies of the Assembly rather than of the Department. There may be a lot to be said for that. And it certainly would be complicated. It would have repercussions because there would be other commissioners and other arm's-length bodies currently sponsored by departments which might take the view that they also would want to become ALBs of the Assembly. What is certain is that it would take thought, and it couldn't be done by the transfer of functions order, because the transfer of functions order can only transfer functions between departments. Right. I mean, from what I've seen, though, it's not my area of work, but I gather that OFMDFM would be, or presumably the Department for Communities in the future, would be open to the idea of consideration being given. Now, at the moment, I think the main body which is sponsored directly by the Assembly is the Ombudsman, soon to be the Public Services Ombudsman. And it would be, I mean, a significant change in the balance between the Assembly and the Executive to have more ALBs than the Public Services Ombudsman dependent on the Assembly. But there's nothing to stop that being taken forward.
But that is something you're suggesting which would need more thought, as in public consultation?
It would be
a policy?
It would certainly be public consultation. It would be considering, I think, in particular, what the precedent would be for other bodies. I mean, there are many other commissions, the Equality Commission, there are many other bodies of an advisory capacity. I know the argument has been made, for instance, for the Environment Agency becoming an ALB of the Assembly rather than of DOE, future DERA. Now, all of that has implications about the way in which the balance within this devolved administration sits between the executive administration and the Assembly. And it might be one for the next mandate, but it certainly couldn't be done through the transfer of functions order.
Was there any consideration given to using this as an opportunity maybe to introduce new policies and new functions? For example, I know the Ards Peninsula Coastal Erosion Group would have loved to have seen a lead department for coastal management, but we're told that actually is not a transfer function, that's a new function.
It's a new function, and it's something that would require primary legislation. I mean, particularly if we're talking about policies which are going to actually have an impact on the ground, which might require funding, grant making, etc. That could only be done through primary legislation. And I must say, since this was announced, a number of departments have been in direct contact with me saying, you know, we've had an idea for a long time. Would it be possible to get it squeezed into the TOFA? And I've had to say to them, sorry, what you're talking about is primary legislation. It's a new policy. You've got to go through the process of primary legislation for that. The TOFA was not a short step or a shortcut to making primary legislation.
On that basis, then, is it possible, at least, that when we get to the far side of the 5th of May and into the negotiations of the programme for government, that we could have a whole lot of new functions being considered, and there could be another raft of changes?
Sorry, after the election, when we have a new mandate.
When we talk about a programme for government,
yeah. These
people who are saying, can we use this as an opportunity to do this, that and the other, well, maybe that's going to come back again.
They could feed into the programme for government.
The Committee for Employment and Learning, they have a concern about the inclusion of further education and higher education in the Department for the Economy, and that may place too firm an emphasis on education for employment rather than for the wider benefit to students. Any consideration given to further and higher education going anywhere else?
Well, a few years ago, I think it was about 2011 or 2012, there was a proposal at that point that there should be a merger between DEL and DETI, but that DETI, or DEL rather, should be split with further and higher education going to the Department for Education. And there was at that time considerable resistance to that, particularly from the further education sector. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Executive was keener this time for those two elements of the education system to move to DETI. And the argument which was made then was that further and higher education were actually part of the real economy rather than part of the Rathgale, if I might use that expression, education system. And I do remember being accosted. That had nothing to do with the matter at the time, but I do remember being accosted by a leading figure in further education who made these points vociferously, and I had to tell her, sorry, it's not mine.
Okay. And one other from that committee, the Employment and Learning Committee, Tony. Concern about the lack of engagement that committee had on restructuring, including no sight of the transfer functions order. So did OFMDFM, as the lead department, encourage other departments to liaise with their statutory committees? Do you know?
Other departments, at an official level, other departments would have seen a work in progress on their own bits of the transfer functions order. They would not have seen the completed draft until the point where that was circulated to the executive in December. I don't know what the plans of this committee are, but I'm assuming it may be circulated to other committees by this committee.
We have indeed asked for responses from other committees. Yeah, and we will be back in touch. Members, I have only one final question. Anybody else wish to? Chris?
Thanks. Just to touch on, sure, about the, I suppose, mechanisms for redress. If any of these functions maybe haven't went to the right place, and you're saying there's absolutely none, there's nothing, once these functions have went, there's no review in 12 months' time, there's no measures in place to look again, perhaps, at some of these?
There are no plans at the moment for review, but as I said, it's not to say that coming out of the work of the programme board, which is going to have, and has had, an external input from what's called a gateway review, and will have again shortly, that there would not be a recommendation for a review of the process in a certain now. Ex post review, the theory varies. Is best done after 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. Is dependent on the nature of the changes that's being done. But that could be a recommendation coming out of the programme board.
Alex Abbott.
Just to confirm some matters from last week that were touched upon, when the affirmative resolution comes forward to the Chamber...
Sorry, Mr Abbott, I can't hear you, could you?
Sorry, just to confirm some matters from last week to begin with. When the affirmative resolution comes forward from FMDFM...
Sorry, I can't hear.
So, when the affirmative resolution comes forward from FMDFM to the Chamber, it can't be amended?
No. It's affirmative resolution. It's either affirm or reject.
And there's no procedure to amend any part thereof?
No. I mean, the process in this case is that it's being given to the committee in draft. The committee may make recommendations. Those will be taken into account in the finalisation of the order, which will then be given to the executive for their view and approval, and then it will go to the then be made by FMDFM.
You will have heard last week, on the face of it, there's a tension between retaining the power to appoint a commissioner, but not retaining the policy function in FMDFM. That happens both in respect to the Children's Commissioner and the Persons Commissioner. So could you explain the thinking in that regard? Why retain the power of appointment and not retain the function fully?
This is in relation to the two age commissioners. I mean, the view that was taken was that these are important figures with an important role to play, and that it was important that they should have the confidence of the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister. And therefore, the First Minister and Deputy First Minister should play a role in the appointment of those two particular commissioner posts.
That argument, of course, could apply to multiple other public...
It could, and it applies to some others, such as the Police Ombudsman, as I mentioned before.
I think that was the only one that you were able to mention before. Are there any others?
Sorry, are there others? I can't recall any others in the field of OFMDFM, where FMDFM make that appointment. In the case of the Equality Commission, the Secretary of State makes the appointments, though the Commission is sponsored by OFMDFM.
It's a curious one that you mentioned, the Police Ombudsman, because whilst it was not agreed, because nothing was agreed in terms of the negotiations last autumn, it appeared, I don't think I'm overstating this, but it appeared to be the case that when it came to the appointment of the HIU director, which originally had been proposed to be in the hands of FMDFM, it seemed to be that that was moving to be appointed other than by FM and DFM. So I'm just pointing out that these decisions in terms of appointment of senior posts, there was indications that even last autumn, that which was proposed to go to FMDFM was actually going to go to other places. So I'm just pointing out that whilst there may be an argument about strategic appointments at FMDFM, that argument seemed to be moving in a different direction last autumn when it came to the appointment of the HIU director. But see if that argument about these are significant posts, was there any other argument why the FMDFM wanted to hold on to that power of appointment?
No, as I said, it's the significance and importance of those two positions that led FMDFM to want to have a situation where they could be sure of having confidence in the post holders. Now, I should say in all of these cases, whether it be the two commissioners or the police ombudsman, that these appointments are made on merit and they're subject to the oversight of the Commissioner for Public Administration. But ministers will, in all public appointments, are meant to have a rule at the very end. And in the case of these three, the expectation was that FM and DFM would make the final decision on the appointment on the basis of the recommendations of an independent interview board.
Of course, the appointment that you don't recall at the moment is the appointment of the Victims Commissioner. That's also appointed by FM and DFM, isn't that right?
Sorry, I missed that?
Victims Commissioner.
The appointment of the Victims Commissioner is also FM.
The Victims Commissioner is appointed by FM, DFM, and that is remaining with the Executive Office.
But that was one that
Sponsorship,
you,
yeah. So there'll be no separation between the sponsorship and the appointment.
but that's one that you hadn't recalled last week or this week. And curiously, that's the one that gives me the concern about why FM and DFM are retaining the appointment of the two other commissioners, the power of appointment of the two other commissioners, as the experience of the Victims Commissioner and the dog's dinner that has arisen in respect to the appointment of Victims Commissioner doesn't give you great confidence that these matters are going to be handled necessarily in the best way. And that's why I firmly believe appointment should have gone to the new sponsoring department rather than retained by FM and DFM.
Well, Mr. Howard was just making the point that the Victims Commissioner is appointed by FM and DFM.
It hasn't been a very
Put it a successful appointment, as he would see it.
Hasn't it? Well,
If you're not
matter of judgment.
offering me a bowl of Win-A-Lot there, Alex.
There's no reference to anybody in the room. Thank you.
Right, Deputy Chair Chris Little.
Thanks, Chair. So the statutory committees have 2 weeks in which to have gained sight of the transfer of functions order, consider them and consult with people and respond to OFMDFM. Is that a reasonable amount of time to undertake this piece of work?
It's a pressured situation, and I think everyone involved has been clear it's going to be a pressured situation from the point where this was unblocked by the Fresh Start Agreement. I mean, my apologies, but we've been moving as fast as we can, and it's not an ideal situation. Ideally, I would have liked to have been at this situation 2 months ago. We did have to change tack fairly significantly after the Fresh Start Agreement.
How long do you think it would have been a reasonable amount of time to give statutory committees on this? 2 months, did you say?
No, I said I would like to have been at this situation 2 months ago. But remember, there is going to be a number of points
us?
after the 12th of February. There's going to be a number of things which will happen. There's going to have to be a revision. I'm assuming you're going to be making some recommendations. We're going to be giving a view to the First Minister and Deputy First Minister on the recommendations made by this committee. That might mean a revision of the order. It then need to be cleared by the Executive and then come back to this committee for what is the standing orders requirement for consideration by a committee of a statutory rule, and at the same time it would go to the examiner of statutory rules for his consideration of it. And then when you take into account the fact that we're going to have to go to the executive or to the Assembly at the very end of the mandate for an affirmative resolution debate, I mean, the pressure's really coming from that side.
Yeah, Chair, there's little point in me scrutinising the officials for the reasons for that delay, but having a pattern of delay whenever we're trying to work on items of business in this committee, and then for the department to come to us and say you've 2 weeks to respond to something of this significant is really disappointing. It's not the correct way to do government, frankly. One last question. Do you consult with, or how do you consult with ministers in relation to the proposed transfer of functions order? How do you consult with ministers?
How do we consult with ministers through the executive process?
Has that taken its course?
Yes,
The executive was cleared.
in this case, the decision was taken by urgent procedure, but there had been correspondence with all ministers. I mean, they were circulated in December with the text of the transfer of functions order.
And
I think almost all ministers did reply.
It was what, sorry?
Sorry?
I didn't cut. How did the ministers reply?
Well, I'm not really at liberty to talk about internal executive correspondence.
Okay, have ministers raised any recommendations or concerns in relation to the transfer of functions order?
Well, various ministers give their views, but that's an internal executive process, and I can't really discuss that.
Okay. What's the difference between a minister and a statutory committee giving a view? What is the difference between a minister having a view and a statutory committee having a view?
Well, the executive procedure is confidential, and the decision is as the executive has taken it.
Okay. And were there many recommendations raised as a result of the executive process?
The executive agreed the draft transfer of functions order.
Okay. And there's no further opportunity then for any other recommendations to be considered via ministers? It's purely statutory committees at this stage?
You can come back from the statutory committee, and the executive will see the comments at that stage.
Okay.
It was urgent procedure, not executive agreement.
Executive
I checked
decision
this with the
taken.
Executive Secretary. It is regarded as such because it is then tabled subsequently
Tabled for noting.
on the next Executive, and that was done at the next
for noting
Executive.
as opposed to a fully fledged executive agreement.
Sorry?
It is tabled for noting as opposed to being a fully fledged executive discussion leading to agreement. There is a difference.
Yes, there is a
Maybe no
difference.
difference in terms of the legal authority, ultimately, but the process leading to that authority is different.
Okay, I think it is probably something that could be taken up with the ministers when they're with us in a couple of weeks. Tony, one last question. As I said, under our new regime, we will have an executive office, and below that, 8 departments, variously the Department of, the Department for, the Department of, the Department of, the Department for, Department of, and Department of. What's the difference between the Department of and the Department for?
There's no particular difference, and I don't know why, for instance, the Department for Infrastructure was given any preference to the Department of Infrastructure, but that was the agreement which the Executive reached last February, I think, and in all the documentation since then we have adhered rigorously to it, and of course once it's in the Department's bill and the Department's bill is passed, that is the force of law.
No consideration given to making them all one or the other?
Department for Communities carries a better import than the Department of Communities.
Why is that?
It's an indication of mission, I suppose.
Service.
This is the Department of Health. Would it not be better
Department of Health, but it's
for
not
health?
the Department
Because
of
we're
Health,
for health.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, there's a long history of the Department of Health and Department of Education and of
And
Justice.
Department of Justice. Would it not be better to be the Department for Justice?
Well, I think these little inconsistencies we can all live with.
So there's no rationale.
There's no rationale. And when you see the determination of ministerial functions, you'll find that it will be the Minister for Infrastructure and the Minister of Health to align with all of that.
Fantastic. Tony, Jeffrey,
Okay.
thank you very much. Members, as we will not meet next week, and the deadline for responses is the 12th of February, we will have to decide at our next meeting whether we wish to make a submission. At this stage, do we think we do?
Yeah, I would imagine so, yeah.
Will we have a consensus?
What do you have in mind?
I have views in relation to the employment service, specifically, for example.
I'd have views, obviously, in respect of appointments. But we're not likely to have consensus.
There's one area, may I?
Like that quickly.
May I? Yes, it may be better as done on a party political basis, but there is, may I risk suggesting there might be one specific area where we might make a recommendation as a committee, and that is that there is an ex post review. Because it seems it is I mean, everybody's saying this is a huge, comparatively huge reorganisation. I don't think it would be reasonable to expect it to be 100% on the money, because some of it has to be a judgment call. So to just say there should be a formal review, and they have a programme board, so it's not as if we're asking them to put into place structures or resources which are not already there. I think it's good practice in government to review what you do. Could we think about that for
Yeah, I can agree with that.
a fortnight's time?
Yeah.
Beyond that, I think it is a bit of a stretch to aim for consensus. Members, we haven't received a great deal of response to views from statutory committees, so could I suggest that we contact them again, make clear we're not meeting until the 10th, and we would very much welcome their views now that the order is published and the deadline looms for responses. Are we content to make that call to the other statutories? Okay.
Sorry, Chair, I just apologies, I missed your earlier comment. So we have no meeting next week then? No?
No. There are no briefings coming up, Chris, and I don't think there's a great deal of point in meeting for its own sake. And the other point, Chris, was the week after is when FM and DFM are due, but it's also likely that the final stage of the NIPSO bill will be at about 2:30 that morning, according to the current indicative timings. It would be terrible if the chair was struck down with flu. Only joking, I'll be there.
I suppose, in fairness to the committees, they haven't had sight of the transfer of functions order, so they are at a slight disadvantage in terms of trying to garner comments. But
that's what I think.
This gives them an amount of time to make that effort.
So if we do that in the next, we get that out tomorrow. And,
I know it's 2 weeks. It's effectively, it's almost impossible for them to do it though, because they'll receive it. They'll first consider it next week, and have to do something in that week, basically. Yeah.
Well, I do think it is a party political response, effectively.
Well, it's been made such, I guess, because the committees have had no material to work with, even to attempt to find agreement on it.
Well, Tony was very clear that any significant changes have come about through the Fresh Start agreement. So, members, any other business at this stage? If not, we are adjourned until Wednesday, the 10th of February, 2 p.m, room 30. Thank you all very much.
This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30.